In this video, I'll be philosophizing on property crime. Yet before I jump into property crime, I'm going to provide you with a certain situation that's exploring the origins of property crime. Starting with cooperators in a cooperation, certain boys and or men and older boys whom are being trained by the cooperative men, that one of these emerging adults, whom is the more upstanding cooperator within various cooperations, and most cooperators think that Rippledonkal is the most best hunter within the cooperations in hunting and the hunter team. In some cases going off with one other individual, and are often coming back with the most success rate in terms of mammalian meat that the boys, the men, the girls, and the women enjoy feasting on. And he has a brother, Tripadinkel, whom admires his older brother, Rippledonkal, for his self-knowledge and or self-awareness, cultivating wisdom in terms of being able to identify the animals easier to capture and or corner, to communicate, and even provides generously his self-knowledge and or self-awareness within meaningful communications to other cooperators whom he goes out with. Yet Tomhoca, whom is a resentful individual that no one within the cooperations tends to like, and even the younger boys have inappropriately commented, and maybe appropriately, asking, why don't we kill Tomhoca? And the elders perhaps commented, well, Dingle-donkle, Tomhoca is a cooperator as well. He's a hunter like us. He may lie all the time, yet everyone contributes a value to these hunting cooperations. And the elder is wrong, as Tomhoca is a defector and or maybe a troublemaker, whom is not likely to desist had one not provided the appropriate treatment to prevent future-oriented criminality. That upon one expedition that Rippledonkal had asked Tomhoca to consider not going on, posteriori to Tomhoca having really strangely begged Rippledonkal to go and capture and or corner a certain deer, whom Rippledonkal had made a joke to his brother Tripadinkel, existing prior to having gone to sharpen his spear. Rahosa. He had a name for his spear, Rahosa. For he was, upon being recognized for his accomplishments within the cooperations as the most likely individual to recognize the responsible worthiness of being honored with being recognized as an elder, whom is within one's later days more likely to be the resultant of one's wisdom cultivated within one's cooperations. Being a successful cooperator, nearly all the cooperators would like to cooperate with, for the wisdom bestowed upon the communications merely being in the presence often of those individuals, not always communicating directly, and in some cases many individuals may be shy to communicate with the wise elder. Yet Tomhoca insists to Rippledonkal to go hunting and capture the deer that they had seen 3 hours and 46 minutes prior. Yet this is in a situation they do not have digital watches and or clocks, relying mostly on certain positions of the sun, not necessarily sundials, yet the movement of the sun within the sky and directions of north, west, south, and east to allowance for certain inferences into more vaguer yet meaningful analytic terms that have the good enough conditions to define what constitutes a meaningful practical communication concerning day, early morning, mid-morning, late morning, noon, early afternoon, mid-afternoon, late afternoon, evening, early evening, mid-evening, and late evening, that is often more difficult to always infer, be it that there is a beautiful and or elegant golden hour that is more ephemeral within one's recollection of certain experiences, holding the self-knowledge and or self-awareness that this tends to be a time that increases risk and yet often is within its due course appropriate for festival and or exciting engaging within the safety of the cooperators within the campsite, and individuals whom tend to leave in this time to their solitude away from others, like Tomhoca, are more likely to be the individuals whom are later found out to engage in certain cheating and or misconducts, having in some cases murdered individuals. Yet Rippledonkal does not think that Tomhoca yet he would take his life, and be it that he attempted, would surely apprehend Tomhoca. Yet, within the journey, submitting to Tomhoca's requests, perhaps annoyed, and or people-pleasing himself, inappropriately, within the one time he may have made a mistake, to go follow Tomhoca, whom is concerned with how others are going to treat him, communicating his self-pity inappropriately, holding many vaguenesses, and yet the clearest concern with not being recognized as the responsible cooperators for often doing nothing in the cooperations and having the least success in terms of capturing the mammalian meat that provides the serotonin within riboflavin, metabolized and or synthesized into the tryptophan often found in turkeys that are big meaty birds that, had you captured a turkey, would provide meaningful benefit to your cooperators, whom are the benefactors enjoying the meat, that allowances for more positive, meaningful emotions within consuming, that most individuals in the cooperations have some self-knowledge from the self-awareness one garners from communicating that the meat tastes amazing, and or experiencing more positivity within eating the meat, and or in situations one may feel ill or sick and does not consume certain food, may experience negative, meaningful emotions, and yet in some cases may think that one may never experience positive, meaningful emotions until a wiser elder asks the individual, well, have you eaten the turkey? And then one says, no, I can't bear to eat the turkey. I feel that my life is on a downward course to what I've learned to be what's surely in my demise. And then the elder responds, you should eat the turkey and see how you feel. And so the individual eats the turkey and or subsequently experiences positive, meaningful emotions, perhaps restoring one's vitality, yet more likely resultant from the serotonin provided from the metabolizing of the riboflavin, allowancing for the metabolisms of tryptophan and or the appropriate moderation of the correct amount of tryptophan to allowance for the migration and or integration and or elaboration of certain future-oriented emotional regulations from the resources provided from the micronutrients in the turkey that is unique to the beige and or brownish meats cooked, browning in meats that allowance for easier ingestion and or metabolizing of micronutrients that optimize one's physical and or psychological health and or physical and or psychological well-being, optimal to experience positive subjective well-being. And this is more likely why meat tends to taste awesome and or unexpectedly good, exceeding what you may expect, compared to certain vegetables and or fruits that are more unreliable in terms of their consistent flavor profile and or yet tend to also provide meaningful health benefits, yet lack riboflavin, and in some cases, insufficient amount of micronutrients to allow one to synthesize serotonin that's most meaningful for a healthy psychological functioning direct perception, most likely to influence your subjective well-being. And this is more likely why girls and or women whom are vegetarian compared to girls and or women whom eat meat are more likely to suffer from chronic illnesses associated with depression and or anxiety, as it's likely that they are lacking the appropriate riboflavin within their diets that are found within the whole foods of meat. That the deer more likely is to provide within the bison meat, allowancing that had one successfully killed the deer and or provided the mammalian meat within the cooperations appropriate to corner and or kill the deer, with Rippledonkal's Rahosa, the spear that is named appropriate for its optimized intercategorical and or intracategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, having optimized the positive consequence to allowance for the most positive consequences in terms of providing benefits to benefactors, compared to avoiding the negative consequence within identifying appropriately the defectors, such as Tomhoca, whom within the cornering of the deer takes a rock and or smashes Rippledonkal's head, whom is preparing Rahosa for the kill, and yet is killed himself after having injured the bison and or allowancing Tomhoca to reap the benefits of bringing the deer back to the camp for others to feast, yet reporting that Rippledonkal had went out to go do some other meaningful self-task he had said was urgent and or couldn't help, and had single-handedly cornered the deer and or done the seemingly impossible, killing the deer and or providing the meat, lacking the self-knowledge and or self-awareness that some of the elders were truly baffled by. Holding the self-knowledge and or self-awareness, this should be impossible. This most likely is not true and or valid. What has happened to Rippledonkal, including whom is in outrage Tripadinkel, Rippledonkal's younger brother, whom is furious with what he has learned and yet has no appropriate explanation to provide what could have happened, thinking more that had Tomhoca attempted to take the life of his older brother, would have surely lost. Be it that his older brother was wiser and or more fit. Within future-oriented, experientially countering the grievances of Rippledonkal, whom is more angry with Tomhoca and yet asked by some elder to forgive Tomhoca for perhaps being the one, and we're not blaming him for being the one, and to give up the hypothesis that he was responsible for his older brother's death, that in some cases there are accidents, and accidents happen, and he should not resent. And it's true, he should not resent, yet perhaps he should be more wiser to not as easier succumb to the temptations of forgiveness, to appear more cooperative, and or should, within a healthy skeptical evaluation of what's proportionate to the evidence, evaluate the more rational, proportionate explanations, including that we may not truly be able to eliminate from our consideration the likelihood that Tomhoca had murdered his brother, be it that it's highly improbable for Tomhoca to have, with merely a rock, cornered a deer himself and brought home the deer meat, and or instead also holds his brother's spear and knows that his brother would never give Tomhoca his spear. Rahosa, meaning that there are certain incongruencies within the communications that one should be more cognizant of, to allowance for sounder rational thinking into what is a more meaningful explanation, to elaborate one's excuses and or justifications for thinking differently, and communicating one's divergences of thinking to excuse one's subjectivity within the meaningful similarities that are uniquely calibrated to the objective evidence. Yet thinks within the situation it is more moralistic to forgive Tomhoca. And so he forgives Tomhoca, whom is the holder of Rahosa now. And or as the current holder, holds undeserved, often reputation for being a more proficient hunter, yet we hold the self-knowledge and or self-awareness that Tomhoca is an undeserving hunter whom truly does not deserve this status. Needing one to calibrate one's thinking to what's more appropriate to the evidence. As Tomhoca and or Tripadinkel venture into the forest to hunt a turkey, yet within the grazing of grass see a deer and decide, hey, let's go get the deer. Tomhoca communicates to Rippledonkal, the heroic Bronzor, whom is too like Tripadinkel skeptical of Tomhoca, whom was the second best, yet never resented nor was truly one whom desired to overthrow Rippledonkal. Reflects on his existencia, thinking what would have to have happened for one of the best hunters, the best hunter, to have decided within the heat of the moment that some other task, especially had they brought the meat that was already good enough to satisfy what most desired in terms of the proportions that they usually consume, to go hunting for the deer and or then cowardly give up the kill to Tomhoca in order to go conduct some other affair, resulting in his sure death, thinking that rightfully Tomhoca is more likely the culprit in terms of taking the life of Rippledonkal. That within the mind wandering, engaging the walking into the shadowy forest in reflection, recognizes a long time has elapsed within his self-reflections, discovering a stick with flint rock to charge the rocks, lighting the fiery flamey flame, the torches of the heroic champions of society, whom the most meaningful opted choice to imitate and or be it one is more cowardly in the imitations of the values, nonetheless may praise and or communicate the heroic deeds of the individuals and or carry on the valued conducts within semantic communications elaborative of the key points that are most meaningful to preserve in order for the wisest among us to engage the strengths within one's originality to reemerge the extraordinary gooder conducts that are associated with the highest good, providing the most benefit in terms of cooperation to other cooperators, appropriately and prudently evaluating the appropriate time and or situation to engage one's strengths. Lights the stick and or recognizes the semblance of intuitive self-knowledge and or self-awareness within the direction Tomhoca and Tripadinkel, Rippledonkal's younger brother, had headed in, thinking that if Tomhoca had done it once, he may be more likely to do it again. This may be a partial truth, yet in this situation is most likely to be true. Let's say, to not from one incident within what's more realistic punish individuals unjustly, yet within this situation, Bronzor is correct to, from the evidence he holds, holding certain self-knowledge and or self-awareness into what Rippledonkal is like and or what Tomhoca is like, and the oddities of Tomhoca now being the owner of Rahosa, undeservingly, as Rippledonkal would not give up his spear to Tomhoca, journeying to discover once again, there he is, Tomhoca, with, in this case, Rahosa, pointing it at the younger brother of its previous owner to unjustly take the life of the individual whom his blood brother had died to the hands of, now within the hands of Tomhoca, the Rahosa, once carried by the will of Rippledonkal. For Bronzor to enter with a decree, a anarchist moral rebellion, to provide the truth claims in his original instantiations that he had written with the stick on the ground. Do not tread past moral bounds. To then provide his rationale for the injustices and or his inference into exactly what he suspects and or now sees clearly is more likely to misconduct within the wrong directions, inferring the pernicious consequence within the negative directions, with the appropriate duty of care to provide the meaningful elaborations into exactly what is wrong with the self-harms likely to ensue from engaging certain misconducts and or the deviation away from the compassionate self-care of an openness to exploration within exploring what is the more probabilistic good, to allowance for more creative solutions to problems in one's existentia, instead of engaging hostile conflicts and or themselves being the individuals whom are least likely to resolve conflicts, with often the inability to engage meaningful intercategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and inefficiencies within conflict resolution, instead engaging the counterproductive intracategorical and or intercategorical ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies, harming the peace within the gatherings during the feasts in camp, when the cooperators tend to come together and consume and or enjoy the benefits within the cooperations as the benefactors to the mutual benefits of each individual whom is contributing the proportionate, expected, and in some cases the best contributions to the cooperators that most individuals positively receive and do not harbor resentments, including Tripadinkel. And now Tripadinkel was more cynical from the resultants of the murder of his older brother's arbitrary death to engage in just and ethical combat, removing Rahosa from Tomhoca within the appropriate judging of what is most correct, even against what the elders had warned him was wrong. To do what Rippledonkal had been weaker in terms of inappropriately allowancing himself to be deceived by Tomhoca and going further to prevent and or mitigate future harms and or justly taking the life of Tomhoca, from having him cornered and or questioning him within his dying breaths, within each proportionate judging of the evidence as it's incoming, whether or not he should let Tomhoca live, to learn that Tomhoca took delight in the murder of Rippledonkal and or would do it again gladly, and or within his being cornered naively attempted to trick the wiser Bronzor, whom even within what he thought and perhaps may carry to the difficulties to clear his conscience whether or not what he had conducted was appropriate in terms of the evaluations and whether or not Tomhoca was lying and cheating when he cried out that he would never harm another individual like Tripadinkel again. Only within being cornered and having the spear Rahosa to his throat, to then pull back and stab him in the heart, piercing his rib cage, ensuring the death of Tomhoca to prevent worse future-oriented, disproportionate threats and or harms and or violence to the other cooperators, that he sought not to take the risk of allowancing Tomhoca to lie and or cheat no longer. Upon this, the gooder is recognized in terms of what may be recognized in terms of needing some sort of law and or precedent to identify the liars and or cheaters within the defectors and the cooperations in order to allowance the most meaningful positive outcomes with the cultivated self-knowledge and or self-awareness into the negative consequence and or negative consequences most meaningful to elaborate what is most appropriate to defections and or to allowance for individuals to learn and or engage more prosociality within the altruistic conducts to avoid being the Tomhocas and or taking the responsible conducts to fairly and or justly evaluate the evidence more unique to individuals whom undergo the deliberate self-reflections that is most complex and or hardest to conduct and or communicate and or even instantiate into the rules, that it's more meaningful to hold and or communicate the identifications of what were the risk factors into Tomhoca's misconducts, yet is also more difficult to, in practice, appropriately recognize. And it's often the Bronzors whom are the individuals whom are able to appropriately calibrate their thinking to calibrated conducts to prevent and or mitigate future-oriented injustices, and or themselves are the individuals whom other individuals go to learn how to conduct themselves wiser, uniquely within the communications of certain key points within the evaluating of one's meaningful existing priors within the experiences of one's rebellions, that one provides the communications into the tolerance one had conducted within one's thinking, and is engaging always tolerant thinking proportionate to rationally evaluating, never truly holding the self-knowledge and or self-awareness within its completeness, yet holds the incomplete evidence to infer what's meaningful, to attempt to fill in gaps the best one may, to infer the most meaningful creative solutions to problems and or conflict resolutions. And most meaningfully, the conflict resolution is more likely to work from what has worked appropriately. To then subsequently be recognized as the appropriate owner of Rahosa. Yet, this is where we hark back to the origins with property law, as this is not realistically how property law was originally instantiated as the first crimes and or the first prohibited misconducts that one misconducted, that one would receive a penalty if found guilty within the evaluation of the evidence, and then proceeding to sentencing upon being found guilty within due process. The origins of property crime derive from concerns with one's will and or the individuals who would receive certain ownership of X property, be it that an individual whom is in possession of X property is not necessarily the owner, and may be a thief and or liar and cheater themselves, whom is a defector. And it's uniquely the individuals whom own the property, calibrated to the possession of the property, that are the rightful owners, and or must be good enough in necessary conditions, be living in order to own X property as the owner, whom is often satisfying certain underlying psychological needs in relation to certain property. Not always, yet be it that one is engaging in a certain tool that maximizes one's fitness to improve the likelihood, one will, in the case of Rahosa, optimize certain uniquely intracategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, not necessarily the intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies that are more unique to certain intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties that are optimizing uniquely killing deer per se, or certain mammals, compared to engaging the spear for other practical, rational rationales one may justify and or excuse to improve one's own unique living conditions. Maybe sculpting, for example, a tree with fine details, learning that Rahosa is not necessarily the best scalpel, and that a smaller, more precise tool, one can detail unique characteristics within wood carving, allowances for the optimizing of certain intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, from inferences into the intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, engaging creative conducts with Rahosa. Yet, individuals whom are the inappropriate and or whom would be bestowed negligently certain properties upon the death of X, whom is the owner of X property, who may claim X property is mine, yet mineness is inherently less meaningful than I own it, and or the ownership of it, as it's the I within the self, whom is the owner, that we are most concerned with. The I own it, not necessarily it's mine, meaning that it's the subjectivity that we infer, not the me and the me-ness of the property that is more superficial compared to the intrinsic connection one holds with the unique self-knowledge and or self-awareness that transforms one's self-knowledge and self-awareness within the holding of the, in some cases, the sacred item one engages creative conducts with, allowancing for the rightful ownership within the maximizing of intercategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies within proportionate conducts that are tolerable and or never misconducts to misuse and or no longer deserve the rights to certain property, perhaps. In some cases, even in some cases, one may commit criminality. Removing certain property may be inappropriate, especially in the cases where the property is irrelevant to the case, yet be it that one engages in robbery and the property that one does own is removed justly and or appropriately within the evidence and or is needed as evidence to prevent future-oriented criminality from being conducted in relation to the possession of one's prior existing property that is negligently misconducted, compared to the individuals whom may engage in certain misconducts and yet whom have their property removed unjustly without any sort of appropriate, proportionate duty of care to evaluate the worse future-oriented conducts and consequences from the violations of one's intrinsic human rights and or freedoms prior existing to property crimes never existed. And even following the substantiation of precedent within property crimes, had a lengthy period of development to be recognized as meaningful. Uniquely, it was the concerns with protection of the public that was most meaningful for the original